With that, I'll bring it around to today's speakers, which are Jackson Blalock and Catherine Corbett. They are coming with us today to talk about a coastal resilience project near the mouth of the Columbia River that was wrapped up earlier this year. Jackson Blalock is the Marine and Estuarine Resilience Program Manager for the Pacific Conservation District, where he assists communities in Pacific County, Grays Harbor County, and Western Wahkiakum County to adapt to environmental changes, such as sea level rise, erosion, and habitat shifts. And Catherine Corbett is the Chief Scientist at the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership, and she brings with her 23 years of experience as an estuarine ecologist, with a focus on climate-smart ecosystem restoration and management, and also integrating climate adaptation and mitigation measures into programming and individual projects. So Jackson and Catherine, thank you so much for taking the time to present to us today, and I will pass it along to you all.
All right, can y'all see that slide?
Yep.
All right, well, Chandler, thanks for doing the intros. That saves us a few sentences, but I'll turn it over to Catherine now to kick it off. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Jackson and Chandler. Jackson and I are going to provide an overview of the project by first discussing the background and goals of the project, and then lessons learned. And then we'll discuss project methods and project outcomes and continued work. There should be plenty of time for questions and discussion. So the goals of the project were to support and increase local capacities for collaborative multi-benefit resilience action. These include recovering Lower Columbia River native habitat. So previous research and modeling, including some by ourselves, has shown future habitat loss with coastal squeeze. And then also to reduce impacts of flooding, coastal hazards, and climate change on communities. And we wanted to do this by proactive planning versus ad hoc reactionary projects that often can occur after an event. So we wanted to identify ways of engaging the community in workshops and coastal resiliency work, identify nature-based solutions and other projects for coastal resiliency, and identify and assist individuals to champion this work. Okay, thanks. This is a map in 2018 with support from Washington Ecology. We received funding from EPA to map multiple sea level rise scenarios in the Lower Columbia and the potential for losing more native habitats through coastal squeeze. We used an Army Corps model that predicts water surface elevation at the mouth of the Columbia and how it translates upriver to Bonneville Dam. And we mapped 3 different scenarios for sea level rise: 0.5 meters, 1.0 meter, and a 1.5 meter. And we worked with our science work group, we're one of 28 national estuary programs like Puget Sound, to then map the generalized impacts of overtopping levees, flooding infrastructure, and submerging habitats. After that, we tried multiple times to secure funds to follow up on this modeling work, to undertake resiliency planning efforts in the Lower Columbia River communities. And we partnered with Washington Sea Grant on this National Fish and Wildlife Grant in 2021 to finally be able to make this happen.
Yeah, so Washington Sea Grant works across coastal topics and geographies of Washington, providing extension services out of the UW College of the Environment. And this is where I previously worked. From 2016 to 2020, Washington Sea Grant developed sea level rise projections, tools, and technical assistance across statewide shores. And that was followed by the Sea Grant-led Resilience Action Demonstration Project, which identified and supported locally driven hazards resilience projects across the Washington Pacific coast. You can read more about that on the WA Coastal Network website. But through that, we heard specific issues across Baker and Grays Bays, which highlighted the need for this work we'll be talking about. So Pacific Conservation District works to conserve natural resources based out of Pacific County. And at the start of this project, Pacific Conservation District had been leading on-the-ground projects and technical assistance across Baker Bay, connected to local landowners, jurisdictions, and ports. And they kind of came out as one of those leading local groups from the Resilience Action Demonstration Project, and really just realizing that it was critical for us to engage with them at the local level to advance tangible material outcomes there. So this work led these three organizations together to collaborate, recognizing that many issues across Baker and Grays Bay had flooding, erosion, sedimentation, and habitat change in common, all issues directly affected by sea level rise. And our team got a grant, as Catherine mentioned, to look into these issues, right? It was led by the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership, and it was through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's National Coastal Resilience Fund, NIFWIF. This project itself focuses on the Washington side of the Lower Columbia, looking at potential sea level rise impacts and how they relate to existing issues, and how can we respond to address present and future issues. I think that's a key point. Grays Bay is in Wahkiakum County, and downstream is Baker Bay in Pacific County. So this region is rural. The only incorporated city along the shore is the city of Ilwaco, with the port of Ilwaco shown in the top left. Below that is the town of Chinook, which has the port of Chinook. In the upper right, highways 101 and 401 run along decent lengths of the Columbia River, while you see the Grays River entering Grays Bay in the bottom right. So it's kind of showing some typology of land use there. Here you see some king tide flooding at Port of Ilwaco, right? So there's a lot of flooding and water level issues in the area. And here's some combined flooding at Rosberg along the Grays River. These are recurring events, right? The Rosberg Hall you see here is where we hosted our Grays Bay workshops, actually. So, community assets being impacted pretty directly. Yeah, Catherine?
Great, thank you. So this brings us to the lessons learned from the project. And a wise colleague once recommended to me that we present project results and lessons early in a presentation instead of at the end, because this is frequently what audience members are most interested in. So cover it first and then repeat it at the end. So a pitfall to this approach is that we risk that you all might tune out early because we told you the story's ending before we walked you through the process of how we got there. But here it goes. A last warning. If you don't like spoilers, tune out for the next 2 slides. So the major takeaways from the project are the resiliency work is a long-term investment in a community, years to decades. This is not a surprise to anyone, I'm sure. But it is critical that you don't underestimate the length and amount of time that this work entails. And that relationship and trust building takes a long time and a lot of effort. And it is important to listen first. And I cannot overemphasize this, that people don't care what you know until they know you care. So projects come later after a long time of listening. Infrastructure and immediate needs are usually the focus early on, and then maybe you can get to habitat focus later. And that it is critical that you find local champions for the individual actions. Developing community-supported resilience actions requires a lot of thought. Getting people to the workshops, showing up at their meetings, sending out lots of mailers, emails, flyers, and scheduling meetings in the evening and providing food and gifts to compensate for their time is important. Information alone, and I know this isn't a shock, information alone doesn't lead to change in the status quo. So storytelling, tying into emotions, listening is imperative, and trying to come up with mutual objectives. Again, listening, much more buy-in and community interest is generated when people and their ideas lead the meeting through facilitated activities. And there's a lot of utility in moving the conversation along in relation to climate change impacts and sea level rise. It's important to allow for emergence of ideas. So it's imperative that you manage your team's expectations to allow for what comes and trust that topics that don't necessarily advance very far through these workshops may reemerge in the future as work continues. And then communicate participant input back to them and how it has informed next steps. Do this repeatedly and do it often. And then there's tremendous value in a diverse skill set within your team. We had scientists, facilitators, a GIS expert, a landscape architect, we had a river restoration engineer, and we had this advocacy campaign / community engagement expert that helped us get the word out and hone our message to the community members. Jackson, back to you.
Yeah, so our team was pretty large, as Catherine mentioned, right? Not everybody here was involved on a day-to-day basis, of course, but beyond the organizations we described, it also involved Wolf Water Resources, engineer support. So overall, we had a pretty robust skill set there that was, able to show up as much as possible in person too, at least when we had these workshops. So what were our methods, right? From 2022 to mid-2024, the project was made up of 3 phases. Phase 1, context and outreach. Phase 2, workshops. Phase 3, projects and plan development. And afterwards, we wrote grants for projects, leading to funds for some specific projects, funds for general technical assistance, and some funds that we're still waiting to hear about. Phase 1 developed contextual understandings of the area, right? That was key. Coming into the project, our team had done some work that we described earlier, modeling, outreach, technical assistance, and projects. And we dug into existing documents and talked to folks to learn more about a wide range of work others had done or were doing, including projects, collaborative efforts, beyond. We also engaged in local dialogue, such as site visits, meetings, existing meetings that were happening, and interviews or just focused discussions to get a better understanding of priorities, issues, hurdles, and ideas. Some of this was even saying, hey, here's our agenda, here's the flyer we're putting out. How would you mark this up, right? Make it helping people that were the intended audiences being part of the process at every chance possible. That led to maps, synthesized insights, strategy for workshops and project assistance, and relationships, very importantly, that informed the remainder of our work. For example, site visits led by local residents highlighted ways that water and sediment was moving and changing, such as here along the Grays River, and also led to on-the-ground perspectives of those high water events that we'd heard about and witnessed. Here you see a photo provided by a local volunteer fireman showing a location in the background of that previous photo, with the driver being airlifted out by the Coast Guard during flooding in December of 23. So phase 2, building from community suggestions in phase 1, our workshop series outline was on the back of each workshop agenda, right? So people knew where they were going, and could provide input on that. The project's goals were to help reduce changing water levels' impact on people and habitats, support those projects, and assist local planning. As noted at the top, there were separate workshop series in Baker Bay and Grays Bay. At workshop 1, participants shared local context and issues. At workshop 2, they prioritized high-level ideas to address those issues. At workshop 3, they identified and refined specific adaptation actions. And afterwards, our team documented what we'd heard to assist local planning and tried to assist some projects. Not shown here, we actually did a 4th workshop at the end for each bay to share out those adaptation projects, the planning documents, and next steps in more detail, just to try to get an idea of, to try to wrap it all up. Overall, we were there to listen, help folks have conversations, and help organize those thoughts into something helpful. So we used surveys at the end of each workshop to understand what participants liked, what they changed, what people learned, and to schedule the upcoming events. And moving forward here, I'll focus on the Baker Bay process in the name of time, but you can see our project website for more information on Grays Bay. So during workshop 1, held at the historic Chinook School in Chinook, participants mapped out current and potential impacts from changing water levels as one of their main activities. There's Chandler, they're helping make it happen. We also asked about community values and assets. We had a handful of message box activities and other type of things to break down complex topics, but asking why were we concerned about flooding and other changes in water level? What mattered to these community members about the community they're in? We grouped all those topics into themes, which can show what helps make the area resilient, and we use these to guide our work as well, along with the other more detailed pieces. So the mapping exercise that I showed led to 5 areas with common themes and related issues. For today's presentation, I'll just focus on one of these areas. So zooming into Baker Bay, then zooming into number 5, the Chinook shoreline, as an example of how these conversations went. For the second Baker Bay workshop, we realized we needed more space, so we migrated to the Chinook School gym, just kind of behind the venue before. So, being flexible with space as you learn. Here, attendees talked through past, present, and future changes to these areas and suggested ideas for adapting to sea level rise and other changes in water level. Here you see the Chinook shoreline. On the right, you see today's mean higher high water in blue. On the left. So yeah, you see today's mean high water in blue, the line, and the FEMA 1% annual recurrence flood in purple, with notes transferred from the sticky note mapping exercise. The future map on the right shows a 100-year storm plus 2 feet of sea level rise, using that kind of as a proxy for future extreme events. Note that the blue just shows areas newly inundated. I think this was a very helpful and easily understandable way for people to read these water level maps, which, as y'all know, can often be hard to interpret, right? So just what's the change going to be is what we're showing here. These maps were coupled with historic imagery and maps to help zoom out from today and situate these places on a larger trajectory of change, right? What they used to look like, what they look like now, what might they look like in the future. So in the future, you can see there will be some new flooding of today's dry areas. The map doesn't show erosion particularly well, but we can imply that there will be increased erosion, especially at areas that people noted as eroding today. And so this area will need to manage higher water and waves more frequently. Afterwards, participants worked in groups to fill out and but so worksheets, several for each site. On the left, you see them, which prompted them to describe issues, connect these issues to other topics, identify constraints, and suggest what should be done. Everyone then voted for their favorites along with other details the group shared for their sites. So that kind of helped us refine what specific adaptation concepts we're going to be digging into a little more, or at least just how to keep that conversation going in line with community ideas. This one, so you don't have to read it, really just talks about sediment management related to the Chinook shoreline. In workshop 3, we dug into specific adaptation actions guided by those and but so sheets and other information. For each site, we shared 4 potential adaptation actions in a framework of harden, move, soften, and a combination of activities. This is where our team had to do a lot of conceptual design thinking and image creation, so we could put something in front of participants for each of these ideas that they would have enough information to respond to, weigh trade-offs, and modify as needed. So for Grays Bay, we also engaged with Pacific Northwest National Labs, or PNNL, to develop water level modeling that reflected community priorities too. This image here represents what the participants selected for the Chinook shoreline. So this was created after that workshop, but kind of has used some of the same base imagery that they were working with. Coming out of that third workshop, participants wanted a soft approach with potential beneficial use of dredge material to build up the shoreline where it currently was armored or eroding, and improve habitat and shoreline resilience. Participants also identified potential partners and project leads shown in the upper left of the drawing. Not just what, but who. And using the other information shared through workshop activities and other discussions, we were able to create a rough adaptive capacity analysis for each project concept, right? So 6 for each bay, to identify next steps for different partners, highlighting key next steps and that we saw as most important based on the input. That adaptive capacity analysis for the Chinook shoreline, as you see here, shows that motivation for adaptation was high, access to resources was medium, authority to implement decisions was low given the amount of in-water work and multiple landowners involved, and the ability to learn and innovate or adaptively manage the project was high. So that leads us to, kind of a no-brainer, say, all right, we really need to coordinate across multiple parties here and develop designs that we can put in front of regulatory audiences too, to see if this is something that we can get authority to go forward with, given that there is some adaptation motivation here. At the bottom, participants connected each project to relevant local priorities or resilience principles from earlier, which we think can be useful to highlight with writing grants, but also with design development, right? Make sure we include social spaces and water access within the design concepts here, that kind of thing. Across the top 6 projects that were prioritized and created by participants for Baker Bay, we listed out who was involved most. There's a parallel version of this for Grays Bay. Groups at the top were noted participants in 5 of 6 projects, down to groups at the bottom that were noted as participants in 1 of 6 projects. Okay. So returning to this project along the Chinook shoreline, we broadened the scope a bit as conversations unfolded and engaged with more parties, right? Thinking of that list of organizations, this larger geographic approach was in line with the local priorities and resilience principles identified by workshop participants, such as focusing on infrastructure, right? We extended it to catch more of the Highway 101 there, but also allowed us to engage with more partners that could set the stage for future collaborations necessary for other resilience work in the area. Seeing this as a form of capacity building, which that idea, that approach of really trying to get people involved who might also be able to develop other collaborations in the future was initially highlighted during the Resilience Action Demonstration Project that I mentioned earlier and is hosted on the Coastal Hazards Resilience Network's WaCoastalNetwork.com website. Pacific Conservation District and the ports of Chinook and Oahu put in a grant proposal resulting from this for design, development, and coordination, which we hope to hear about later this month. This collaboration now has support from Pacific County, the Chinook Indian Nation, Washington State Department of Transportation, and Washington State Parks. Here you see their recent sea level rise assessment for Fort Columbia State Park, which this work hopes to assist. We've also begun conversations with the U.S. Army Corps about collaboration on beneficial use of dredge material through their Continuing Authorities program. So a lot of moving parts led from these conversations that otherwise were kind of just happening in splintered groups. I've been focusing on a single project, right? This one along the Chinook shoreline, but we scoped out 6 for Baker Bay. These covered flood barriers, distributed stormwater management, integrated floodplain and watershed management, nature-based erosion control, and even housing planning. For Grays Bay, we also scoped 6 projects covering dredging, integrated floodplain and watershed management, stream monitoring, and watershed modeling. All projects here with stars had a grant or a similar proposal written for next steps. And keep in mind, these projects are what the community members desired and scoped. While some, particularly dredging, may be problematic for habitats and of questionable likelihood of being permitted, we believed it was best for us to remain neutral and help tell the community's stories and help them test these ideas out and see where they go. So to read about each of these, you can see either of the websites at the top where there's more graphics and whatnot. So I'll give you all a second to look at those if you want, but you can find it online. So now let's move into some lessons learned and dig a little deeper into that. Catherine, over to you.
Yeah. So our lessons learned can be grouped into 5 overarching themes, addressing hurdles for community participation, sustaining involvement necessary for building trust, common understanding, and tangible results. The value of this approach for advancing hazards and climate adaptation conversations, the topics that need more focus, and linked foundational issues affecting coastal resiliency and requiring larger collaborative efforts. So the first lesson, addressing hurdles for community participation. So the idea is to build local interest and relevance for people to show up at your workshops and your resiliency conversations. So getting people to the workshops, showing up at community events was one thing that Jackson ended up doing a lot of one-on-one conversations, and we all sent mailers, emails, flyers. We sent flyers and widely disseminated media press releases that requested photos of king tides to generate interest in our workshops, also to gather data on those areas that are already susceptible to flooding. So then we scheduled the meetings in the evenings when community members are not at work, and we also provided dinner and gift certificates or something to compensate them for their time. Another lesson was to set realistic expectations, so allow for emergence. And I know Jackson touched on this earlier, but manage your team's expectations to allow for what comes and trust that topics that don't advance very far during these workshops may reemerge in future as well as the work continues. And then listen, and listen again. Let local ideas lead the way and shape progress of your workshops and your project. You'll get much more buy-in by the community and community interest when people's input leads the meetings through facilitated activities, which is what we did. And then communicate participant input back to them and how it has informed next steps, and do this often and repeatedly. And then something we struggled with is attendance was great, but what is next? How do you get people to support projects that they are passionate about beyond the workshops?
Yeah. Next, sustaining involvement, right? The necessary for building trust, common understandings, and tangible results. So, as we think we all know, local organizations are necessary to keep the work going, but also to bring people to the table, right? Whether it's project leaders, key partners, otherwise. This also really mattered with the project team. Being a local resident allowed me to build trust and have more day-to-day awareness. And also, man, I could show up regularly in person instead of remotely, when remote isn't even an option usually, and all the benefits that go along with that, just being able to meet people where they're at. Info alone doesn't lead to a change in the status quo. Catherine mentioned this earlier. More education is always needed to a broader audience, but also patience and longer term engagement. Thinking of our work as just one event in a longer stream of activities, and just trying to keep that water flowing beyond us, but trying to go in a way that's productive. This plays in this idea of like info changing status quo. I think especially plays in with like modeling, right? PNNL did a great job listening to community priorities and presenting modeling as a result there. Those conversations didn't just happen once, right? It's keeping on going, and we're hoping to keep that engagement going around whether certain single approaches would reduce flooding. And people understandably often want a single, simple, effective solution rather than maybe a network of approaches that requires a lot of distributed action and adaptive management that might actually be more resilient. So based on successes elsewhere, we've seen pilot projects have success advancing those new approaches too, especially when they're publicly visible. So iterative and duplicative outreach can be useful, right? To build relationships and the uptake of information with different audiences through different but perhaps similar activities at different times. So just keep it on with what you're doing, and try to make it adaptively managed within the feedback of what people want and what works. There's an ongoing need for regular forums for communication about immediate and long-term habitat and hazard priorities and sharing that info, right? Collaborative approaches are necessary to address these complex issues. And a lot of these are going to take multiple generations to address, right? So engaging with multiple generations of audiences and just keeping the sharing information. WCAG and Marine Resource Committee is doing some great work building from this too in that vein. And plan for a significant time commitment. Our team took a lot of time doing this, at least more than we expected initially, as well as workshop participants too. But we got encouraging results and positive responses across the board. But if possible, plan your budget a little higher than expected. Seek funds that allow simple compensation for workshop participants' time, right? And I say simple in the sense of not a lot of forms to fill out or anything like that. That's actually not worth it sometimes. And find funds to keep going after the main project is done, right? Ensure you have a diverse skill set within your team too, and they can see where it goes. Catherine?
I think a lot of the lessons that we're talking about are very intertwined. So the value of this approach for advancing hazards or climate adaptation conversations, this work it identifies potential next steps and support for complex issues and continued conversations. It was a one-time project. However, I think what we're saying over and over again is that these kind of things are like long-term efforts. And so a one-time project is not going to solve anything, but it allows us to move the conversation along. It socializes innovative adaptation concepts that are not the typical go-to idea for a community. So it moves beyond the status quo was a big hurdle that we ran up against, but looking at longer-term past, present, future trajectories of places was helpful to get people thinking creatively. It acknowledges the complexity and allows for the emergence of ideas, which takes time. It is a challenge to not oversimplify topics, forget about longer timescales for this project, or expect we know the solutions. We are just fitting in at one small moment, but hopefully this work continues to sustain our efforts over the long term. And then the value of this work also brings local, regional, state, federal, and tribal audiences together to leverage local knowledge alongside transferable lessons learned and innovations from elsewhere in the region. I think we pulled a lot of stuff for a lot of lessons from outside of the area, the immediate area, into this work in the conversation. And it's also useful to have federal representatives involved to access funding and assistance that we otherwise would not be able to access at those state and local levels.
Yeah, and some topics that need some more focus, right? And this is something we're trying to keep in mind as we adapt this, kind of framework to another project we're doing along the lower Willapa River with similar goals. Is habitats and non-human centric ecologies, right? It's hard to bring this in as a focus when community priorities often focus on infrastructure and built environments. So it's easier to bring this in, later on, perhaps, once you've kind of addressed those low-hanging fruit, or bring it in as criteria for making sure those projects are resilient and competitive for funding. But habitats and non-human species need specific focus to keep as a priority there. Education and examples about hydrology and ecological process would have really advanced the conversations, I think, a lot, to ensure participants are coming in with a common understanding of the science or just the processes we're discussing that relates to this work, whether through workshops or other less formal events. Similarly, education and examples about project development, right? Well, most people are not contractors or grant writers or project managers. So what's the timelines, permitting requirements, and funding criteria to kind of help provide some sideboards for work that doesn't stifle creativity, but actually helps people not spin their gears on stuff that might not be functional. Fourth, youth engagement, continual educational program, right? Many of these, as I mentioned, are multi-generational projects, but this is also a way to inform parents, right? We all hopefully talk to our kids. So this connects to other local priorities we've also heard regarding local job training and providing opportunities for people to stay local as they grow up through that workforce development. Another is better involving tribal representatives, right? This is interesting, I think, because it plays into how the tribes have been interacting in this area that we are working in that in the Grays River, the Cowlitz tribe's work was leading the way and served more as a case study than something we could actively support. So thinking of, well, we weren't at a degree of refined work to plug in, really. It was more just, hey, can you just share information into our workshops about how this is happening? And but also the Chinook Indian Nations territory covered this whole project, and they expressed interest, but the participation was limited, presumably due to not being federally recognized rather than not being interested. Lastly, trauma-informed communication and conflict resolution-oriented facilitation will be a great skill set to have within the team. Could be very helpful, right? More recognition of how past flooding and current social issues affect people, and how problematic experiences have shaped public opinions in ways that may or may not be productive for this work or for meeting community goals. So, yeah.
And then I think lastly, the linked foundational issues affecting coastal resilience. In our case, upland forestry practices promote increased flooding downstream, and along with ownership of those lands, those folks were not at the table, but control a vast swaths of the uplands that affect the flooding downstream. Also, limited affordable housing availability, which can exacerbate flooding by incentivizing the construction of homes in flood-prone areas. And then limited access for emergency services to areas blocked by floodwaters, overtopping roads. Limited local capacity. Local rural governments can't tackle these issues on their own and need help. Also in leading resilience actions and advocating for them on a larger scale in other related activities. And finally, economic trends that exacerbate and propagate these foundational issues, all of which are intricately linked to each other.
Yeah,
I think I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I think this last slide is important because it's more looking ahead in a way to what's beyond what we believe we could be part of substantively, right? In that these are ones where they would require much larger collaborations to address. And I think some of y'all who are here in the audience are hopefully positioned in ways you can advance these conversations, right? To these more regional issues, I'd say. But I think there are specifically characteristic of rural natural resource dependent communities and the hurdles as well as assets that are there. So yeah, last slide, right? Thanks for having us speak. We know there's a lot of information at the end, but please share any questions you have. Hopefully it was helpful. You can read the full report and project descriptions at wacoastalnetwork.com, the CHRN's website. And if you get there, click the Regional Resilience Initiatives at the top, then click Local, and then click Bay to Bay. I think that's what it's called. And or Lower Columbia, maybe that's what it's called. But then you can also go to mer.civiccd.org. That's our programs webpage. And on that, you can click Lower Columbia River, and that'll take you directly to that same Coastal Networks page a little more quickly. And our emails are right there if you're interested to touch base. But I'll turn it over to Noah and Chandler now for any questions or ongoing facilitation. Thanks.